Greetings, everybody. My name is Rich Hatfield. I'm a senior conservation biologist for the Xerces Society. I'm based here in Portland, Oregon, in the beautiful Pacific Northwest, and have the privilege of emceeing this event this evening. The title of this event is the Ecology and Conservation of Bumblebees. We'll be spending the next couple of hours going through just that, the ecology and conservation status of bumblebees. We'll be talking about their threats and conservation status, and also what you can do to help these incredible animals. We really appreciate you all being here this evening. I know it's a busy time of year. It's a beautiful time of year in many parts of the world, and we appreciate you hanging out with us and talking about bumblebees. At the end of the webinar here, there should be plenty of time for us to do kind of a question and answer. So throughout the evening tonight, if you have questions that you would like to have answered, we ask that you use the Q&A feature of Zoom and not the chat. As you can see, if you're monitoring the chat right now, it gets very busy as people start adding things. And it's really hard for us as panelists to monitor that. So if you have a question that you'd like to have answer, please use the Q&A feature. You should be able to find that in the bottom bar of Zoom. You may not see it immediately, but there may be a button with 3 dots that says more. If you click on that, you might see the Q&A there, and you should be able to find that and then enter your questions in there. And we will either type our answers in there. There's 6 of us here tonight, so we'll be able to live answer your questions for a lot of them. We may save a few of them for conversation at the end of the webinar if they feel like they're bigger questions that are worth discussing. But if you have any small or large question you'd like to have answered about bumblebees, feel free to put your questions in there, and we will do our best to respond to them. If for some reason we don't get to them tonight, for the last couple of years, we've tried to take all of those questions and answer them in the days afterwards, and then send an email out with answers to those, and we'll post them in the show notes also on YouTube. So the other things to just be aware of with Zoom here, most of us, I think, are fairly familiar with this platform at this point, but there should be an option for live transcription and translation services, and you should also be able to find those in the bottom bar there. So if you're someone that needs those services, please do seek them out. You can add a note in the chat or in the Q&A if you need some help finding those things. And then also, yeah, I think that's probably it. The only other thing that I would say as far as logistics would go will just be that there is a raise hand feature that is available there. I will just say that when you're presenting, sometimes that creates the screen to flash a little bit, and it is a little bit distracting. So we're probably not going to be calling on people for the most part, so I would ask that you refrain from using the raise your hand feature if you could. It's just a little bit easier for all of us. With that, I'm going to let my panelist team here introduce themselves, and they will all let you know which Atlas project that they coordinate. Before we do that, I briefly introduced myself. I will just say that I'm based in the Pacific Northwest. I mostly coordinate and lead the Pacific Northwest Bumble Bee Atlas, along with Molly Martin. And Molly Martin is not joining us this evening. She is on maternity leave. So she recently had a baby and is out of the office until around a month from now. So she will not be joining us, but it would normally be here with us and is certainly here with us in spirit. And then Avery Young, who runs and coordinates our Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas, is not able to be with us this evening either. And she sends her hellos and regrets for not being able to be here. But the rest of our panelists are here, and I will let them introduce themselves. Jenny, why don't you kick us off?
Hello, everyone. My name is Genevieve Pajesic. I go by Jenny. I help run the Bumble Bee Atlas programs in Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, and Minnesota. I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I'm getting really excited to start seeing bumblebees out here. And I'll pass it to Katie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Lamke. I help coordinate the Great Plains and Midwest Bumble Bee Atlas, so the states that Jenny just named, plus the Dakotas and Kansas. And I'm based in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Dolan. I'm the coordinator of the Mountain States Bumble Bee Atlas, which is Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. And I am helping to launch the brand new New Mexico Bumble Bee Atlas this year as well. I'm based in Grand Junction, Colorado.
Hey everyone, my name is Michelle Toshak. Really great to be here tonight. I coordinate the Montana Bumble Bee Atlas and I am based in Livingston. This is my second year with Xerces. I'm going into the third field season and excited for what's to come for this field season.
Hi, everybody. I'm Leif Richardson. I coordinate the California Bumblebee Atlas. I am based in Riverside in Southern California, and we are kicking off our 5th year of the California Bumblebee Atlas.
Great. And with that, I think I will kick us off. Feel free to continue to let us know where you're joining us from in the chat. It's always fun to monitor that. I'm going to share my screen here. And I will just say that we also, in addition to the Xerces Society folks that are with us tonight, we do have some external partners that would normally be joining us, but also aren't able to be here tonight. The two main partners that have actively participated in this webinar in the past are Elaine Bernstein and Elise Bernstein and Elaine Evans from the University of Minnesota. And they're also not able to be here tonight, but we certainly appreciate their contributions to the Bumblebee Atlas project and our understanding of bumblebee conservation and ecology. Leif, I can still see you. Are you seeing my slides okay? Okay, great. I'm going to jump right in then. And the way this is going to run is I'm going to talk for probably about 15 minutes, and then I'm going to pass it on to Leif, and we're just going to rotate. The six of us are going to present one little section here. And then, as I said, we'll do Q&A kind of throughout, and then we'll end with a Q&A session at the very end. Most of us here, or actually all of us here on the call or on the webinar tonight, we all work for the Xerces Society. If you're not familiar with the Xerces Society, we're a nonprofit organization. We were founded in the 1970s by a gentleman by the name of Bob Pyle. We were named after the Xerces blue butterfly, which was the first butterfly to go extinct because of human activity, it is believed. That species was once native to the San Francisco Bay Area, and unfortunately no longer is present on the planet. But our organization lives on in its legacy, and our goal or our mission is to protect invertebrates and their habitats. And we do that from a number of different avenues. Outreach and education, events like this are one of the ways that we do that. Community science, like the Bumblebee Atlas projects, is another way that we do that. We also do direct science and advocacy and have a number of programs that we work on. Our sort of main flagship programs are our bumblebee conservation programs, our butterfly conservation programs, our firefly conservation programs, and our freshwater mussel programs. We also have a team of folks that are working on working lands, that are working with farmers and other working lands folks across the country to help improve and install habitat that benefits insect and invertebrate biodiversity. We also have a pesticide protection program that's working on the reduction of toxic pesticides in our environment to help protect invertebrates and their habitat. And they work directly with landowners and land managers, and they also work directly through advocacy and legislation to improve regulations that will improve habitat for invertebrates. The Xerces Society is a member-supported organization. If you are a Xerces Society member, I just want to extend my sincere thank you to you for your support of the great work that we do. It really does take all of us to improve habitat out there and to make the world a better place for these animals we care so much about. If you're not a member and you're interested in learning more about what it takes to become a member, or you'd like to join and support our work, there's a URL here on the screen, xerces.org/join, that you can visit and learn how to become a member. There's also a QR code on this screen that you can scan with your cell phone, and it will take you right to our membership page. And I'll just let you know that now more than ever, with the federal funding situation as it is, our member support is more important than ever, and your support is certainly appreciated. You being here tonight is a huge support to us, but becoming a member of the Xerces Society is a wonderful next step for you all to take, and appreciate those of you that are considering it. This program, the Ecology and Conservation of Bumblebees, is really for anybody, but largely it is to benefit our Bumblebee Atlas projects. The Xerces Society is running, basically the team of folks on the call here tonight are running Atlas projects in 21 states. And we're trying to make sure that our volunteers who are out there collecting data on bumblebee distribution and ecology are well informed about the animals that they're out there surveying for. And so we run this program largely for folks in our states with Bumblebee Atlas projects, but of course anybody's welcome to be here and to join. But I do think it is important just to acknowledge this amazing program that has pulled together so many different entities as partners and as funders, lots of state and federal wildlife agencies, other nonprofits, universities, and just another number of other entities creating a true collaborative conservation project with a continental scope. The folks on the call have introduced themselves and let you know where they are coordinating, just to give a little bit of a visualization to that, and to introduce you to Avery Young, who's currently our Southeast Atlas coordinator. Just going to show this beautiful slide that was recently created, and just give you all a sense of where we are all based, and give you a picture of Molly and Avery, who weren't able to join us this evening. All right, with that, I will get started into the ecology portion of the talk. Oftentimes, like if I'm on an airplane or meet someone for the first time, and I let them know that I work on invertebrate or insect conservation, there's a lot of people and more people that get it immediately and understand and want to know more about it. But there still are people out there that wonder why. Why are you spending your time and energy trying to conserve the things that bother me in my life, or that disrupt my picnics, or disrupt my dinners on my back porch? And it is unfortunate that a lot of people have negative interactions with insects, because they are beautiful and they are incredibly important. There are a few insects that are pests that do annoy us, but the vast majority of these animals are out there doing wonderful things for the planet and helping our ecosystem function. Invertebrates are doing a large amount of decomposition. So they're returning nutrients to the soil to ensure that plants can continue to grow, and we can have beautiful wildflower meadows and functional spaces for a lot of other wildlife. They're also out there conducting biocontrol. So they're killing other insects. They're eating other insects that might defoliate some of our trees or some of our crops. And that biocontrol that naturally happens because of our predator insects reduces the need for chemical inputs in our systems. So it reduces the need for pesticides. So having healthy ecosystems with the predators in it is a really important aspect of that. And any use of insecticides kills those beneficial insects in addition to the pests as well. So it really puts the system out of whack when you start using chemicals to try to control the environment out there. In addition to biocontrol and decomposition, insects directly feed a tremendous number of animals out there by just being food sources for them. Grizzly bears eat a lot of insects. Certainly birds do, fish do, and a lot of other animals out there as well. And in addition to those direct ways that insects are benefiting the planet, many insects, especially bees that we'll be talking about tonight, are out there conducting pollination. And so they're pollinating, helping the plants on the planet to reproduce. And that reproduction helps to create the plants that are creating the structure and the food for almost every other animal on the planet, which benefits from that structure or that food. And we're going to drill down now and talk a little bit more about pollination and the bees and the animals that are doing it. So most plants on the planet require an animal to move to pollinate it, and pollination is basically just plant sex. It's the movement of the male parts of the flower, the pollen, to the female parts of the flower. Where it gets introduced is on the stigma, where then fertilization happens, and you get enlargement of the ovaries usually, and the maturation of seeds, which then can create the next generation of plants. And this process is incredibly important for a myriad reasons. One of those reasons is just creating and maintaining diverse plant communities. And this is important for a lot of reasons, nutrient cycle being one of them. So just making sure that those nutrients are staying in the environment and are available for plants in continuing generations. It's also incredibly important for soil stability. When we look at plants, we often only see the part that lives above ground. But as you can see from the figure on this screen, particularly in some of our grassland habitats and prairie habitats, much of the plant biomass is actually below ground. Some of these plants, while they may only spring, 3 to 6 feet above the ground, they can have roots that are extending up to 15 feet below the ground. And that's helping to maintain soil stability. It's helping with water filtration. And it's also helping with carbon sequestration. So as the plants are photosynthesizing, they're taking that carbon and they're storing it in their plant tissues, which are both above and below ground, which is obviously helping us to control climate change. So having diverse plants that are doing these functions in the environment is incredibly important, and that doesn't happen without the pollinators above ground doing the work to help those plants to reproduce. In addition to helping to maintain plant communities, pollinators are also incredibly important to feed wildlife. I mentioned earlier the direct feeding of wildlife. So many animals will directly eat insects, including pollinators. But most animals on the planet, at least some component of their diet, is made up of food or plant-based foods. That might just be leaf tissue, or it could also mean the berries, fruits, nuts, and seeds that are produced in the process of creating those fruits for the plants. And so not only are insects and pollinators directly feeding those animals by getting eaten, but they're also indirectly feeding them by providing those plants, or by providing those food products that animals are eating. And obviously, that's not just benefiting wildlife, it's also benefiting humans. 1 out of 3 bites of food that we put into our body on a daily basis comes from a plant that was pollinated by an animal, and usually that animal was a bee. So they're benefiting and feeding a large proportion of animals on the planet indirectly through pollination. And because of this, we really think about pollinators as what we would call keystone species. And this is an ecological concept that's been around for a long time. And the idea here is that these animals are contributing more to the environment, more to the ecosystem than we might expect just by their size or their abundance. And there are a lot of bees out there, obviously, but their contribution through pollination is so much bigger than we might think just by looking at these animals flying through the landscape. And as it says on the slide here, more than 85% of the flowering plants on the planet require an animal for pollination. And usually that animal is an insect, and usually that insect is a bee. There are 6 main groups of insect pollinators: butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, and bees. And the reason that bees are the most effective pollinator is they're actually actively consuming pollen as larvae and as adults. So pollen is the source of protein for bees, and it's the cake. Essentially, what bees are doing is they move, or female bees are doing as they move through the landscape, is they're collecting pollen and they eat some of that pollen, but most importantly, they create sort of balls of pollen in their nests, and they lay the eggs for their offspring directly on those pollen balls. And when those eggs hatch, the larvae are actually directly eating that pollen. It's the only source of protein for the developing larvae. And so, because bees are actually actively collecting and transporting pollen through the landscape, they're very effective pollinators. Most of those other insect groups that I mentioned, when they're visiting a flower, they're usually only there to drink the nectar, the sugar, or the carbohydrate that is the product from the plant. They're not there to collect the pollen. Or if they are there to collect the pollen, it's really only to eat it. They might be eating a little bit of it, but they're not intentionally moving it through the landscape, which is what bees are doing. And of course, they're not doing that to pollinate. They're doing that to feed their offspring. But the consequence of their behavior is that they are very good pollinators. And most bees have these specialized features on their body somewhere called a scopa. In this case, this is a bumblebee, so it has a specialized scopa called a corbicula, or a pollen basket, where bees groom the pollen, or bumblebees at least, groom the pollen into that portion of their legs where they carry it around. And a really cool thing about bees that also makes them great pollinators for plants is that they exhibit something that we call flower constancy. Each flower out in the landscape holds on to its pollen in a unique way. And when bees learn how to extract pollen from that plant, they can learn how to do it very efficiently. And then once they have done that, they'll go back to that same species of flower because they get really fast at it. And if you're a plant that's trying to reproduce, obviously you want your pollen to go to a plant of the same species and not of a different species. And so it's that flower constancy, that visiting of the same species of flower continually, that makes sure that pollen is efficiently transferred between plants of the same species, and that makes them really effective pollinators. There are a vast diversity of wild bees in the world. There are over 20,000 bees that have been described. There are probably numerous undescribed species of bees out there. In North America, so roughly in Mexico, the United States, and Canada, there's over 5,200 species of bees out there. They have all different sizes and shapes and colors and life histories. And to describe sort of the basic ecology of a bee is nearly impossible just because of how diverse the group of animals truly is. They have different methods of collecting pollen. They have different tongue lengths, which allow them to visit different shapes and sizes of flowers. They have different places that they nest. Some nest above ground, some nest below ground. Some are social, most of them are not. Most of them are solitary. Some of them will visit almost any plant. Some of them only live on one species of plant. There's just an incredibly diverse group of animals out there. And the main reason I tell you this is because we're going to spend most of the rest of the night talking about bumblebees and their ecology. But their ecology is actually fairly strange and fairly unique. And what we learn about bumblebees tonight won't apply to a lot of the native bees that live in North America. Bumblebees only make up of about or less than 2% of the native bees in North America. So what we're learning today is fun and interesting, but it's only scratching the surface of what there is to know about bee ecology out there. So we hope you get interested. We love that you're here to learn about bumblebees, but we also hope you'll take this as an opportunity to seek out all of the other bees out there in the world that are worth learning so much more about. Bumblebees are a diverse group of animals. There are around 250 species in the world. We have around 50 of them here in North America. Um, and you can see just by looking at this chart here that the Pacific Northwest or the Western United States has really the highest number of species, and the lowest really in the southeastern or warmest parts of our country. And so bumblebees are more or less cold weather specialists. They thrive in colder weather, so higher latitudes and higher elevations is where we find the largest diversity of bumblebees. And there are a whole host of other bees that thrive in warmer climates, and we're not going to talk about those tonight. Bumblebees are an incredibly diverse group, but I'm also feeling like Leaf that I'm starting to jump into your section here. Have I overstepped my bounds?
No, I think this is your last slide.
This is my last slide. Okay,
Go
great.
for it.
So I've talked a lot about other bees, but bumblebees are incredibly important for a variety of reasons, and they are worth spending a lot of time talking about. Obviously, they're highly recognizable. They're beautiful. They're fun to observe. They're easy to observe, or relatively, but they have really cool physiology. They can warm their bodies up and fly in cold temperatures, which allows them to operate in cold, wet environments. For spring plants, that's really, really important. They're highly intelligent. There's a video out there that shows them learning how to play basketball and to roll balls into circles for floral or for sugar rewards. They have long tongues and visit diverse shapes of flowers and are important pollinators for many of them, and can use their size and their intelligence for their advantage and become quite innovative. That has some unique pollination syndromes, including what we see for this bottle gentian on the far right here of this slide. So bumblebees are wonderful and obviously worth spending lots of time on. And Leaf is going to tell you more about their life cycle and about their ecology moving forward.
All right. Thank
Are you
you.
going to share your own screen, Leaf?
Should we do that, or do you want to advance?
Up to you.
Okay. I'll ask you to advance if you don't mind.
Okay.
Okay,
Sounds
great.
good.
All right, everybody. So I'm going to start by talking to you about the life cycle of these animals. And so bumblebees have an annual social colony life cycle. It's annual. Obviously, that means that it only lasts 1 year. And we say this to distinguish them from other bees and other animals that have that persist for multiple years. So that would include honeybees, where the queen who is doing the reproduction in the colony might last for multiple years. With the bumblebees, they're annuals, as you will see. And they're social insects. So they live in family units which are marked by a division of labor, interactions between different generations, and cooperative breeding, where not all individuals in the nest are going to reproduce. And this graphic is a beautiful watercolor that shows from left to right what might be late winter to late fall, early winter, the life cycle of the colony. And this example comes from the Midwest. It's the rusty patched bumblebee example. And so this just shows a sort of temperate climate. I'm going to now advance the slide, and we're going to look at this as a wheel instead. Actually, I'm going to ask Rich to advance the slide. Sorry. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about that colony. As I said, it's annual. They're founded each spring, whatever spring means to the particular place on Earth where you are, whether that's January or March or April or May. They're founded each spring by queen bumblebees. That's the caste or the role in the family. We call them queens. They've mated the previous year, and they are just finishing up hibernation, and they're coming out of the ground to found a colony. More on that in a second. As I said, there's a division of labor. So we have the queens, who are the reproductive females. We have workers, who are females who normally do not reproduce and do not mate with males, so far as we understand. And then males sorry, I should have said that the workers perform most of the labor in the colony, and we'll get into some of that more. And the males exist to mate with with new queens out on the landscape. Colonies of these animals can be quite small when mature, as few as maybe 25 individuals for a mature colony of some species that live in the coldest kinds of habitats. And then for some of our species with longer seasons, they might get to more than 1,000 workers. That's a big number, but just bear in mind that a honeybee hive can contain up to 50 to 60,000 individuals, mainly workers. And so this is not a very big social insect colony at all. The nests they're always in pre-formed cavities. The bumblebees are not excavating the cavity in which they nest. Um, those are sometimes hollow logs. They are often rodent burrows, so below ground. And they are sometimes above ground, I should say. They can exist in the wall of a shed in insulation, or under a roll of carpeting in the back of the garage, or this sort of place. There are some that will nest on the surface of the soil, and not obviously in a cavity. And in that case, they will thatch, which means they'll make a little roof for their colony out of dry grasses. Rich, if you want to advance, thank you. So each bumblebee goes through a series of stages from the egg that is laid by her mother or his mother, and resulting in coming out as an adult, being born, if you will, as an adult bee. So if we go to the top middle photo, those are eggs. They look a bit like white rice to me, and in fact, they're about the same size as a typical white rice grain. The queen will lay just a few of them in the first clutch of eggs, 5 to 10 total offspring that she's going to produce herself. Later, the colony, as it's growing, she's laying eggs all day, every day, and the colony will grow much more quickly. After hatching, which happens in about a day, the animal is a larva, and it looks like a grub, like a fly grub or something. You can see some in the next photo going clockwise, and you see an adult female bee who is tending those larvae. Now, they are inside of these little waxy cups. The cup is made of wax that the bee makes with her body, and it's also made of pollen. So they make this mix of wax and pollen, that brownish orange stuff you can see here. That's what that is. So the bees form these little cups. They put the eggs in the cups, or they put the larvae in the cups, and they're moving them around the nest and building larger cups as necessary as the larvae grow. What's really interesting about sociality, one thing that is direct feeding. So we have queens and we have workers who are directly feeding these larvae as they grow. Multiple times a day, they're opening the little container, shoving food into the mouth of the larva, and then closing it up again. And then the next stage here is pupation. So after they go through their larval stages, there are 4 of them, I believe. They pupate, which is spinning a cocoon, just like a butterfly does. And this is done by the larva itself. And then they spend about a week inside of that cocoon before emerging as an adult bee. The whole process takes 5 to 6 weeks, and it depends a bit on temperature and other factors within the nest. So that's one bee's life cycle. They do live about 3 weeks, we like to say, in the field. In the lab, you can easily get a bumblebee to live for 3 months. And so we don't really know outside, but I would say 3 to 6 weeks is probably a good estimate for their full life cycle. If you want to advance the slide, Rich, please. Great. So about that division of labor, well, we have the queens who, as I said, are reproductive females, and the photo here shows eggs, not the animal, the adult animal herself. This is a female insect, female bee. During development as a larva, some things happened that predestined that she would become a queen rather than a worker. It has to do with nutrition and perhaps other things that are being non-food items that are being fed to the queens by their workers who are taking care of them. Workers are sometimes divided into 2 different classes, the larger ones and the smaller ones. Larger ones are more likely to be outside the nest foraging for food. Smaller ones are often found as quote unquote nurse bees within the colony. Although there is a lot of overlap between these 2 categories, And as bees age, they're generally more likely to be out foraging than inside the colony. And then finally, we have these males who are reproductive individuals. They don't forage for the colony. They don't do a lot of care for brood or eggs or the queen when they're in the nest. However, there's some fascinating studies that show that they can and sometimes do help to incubate their offspring in that larval stage. Probably doesn't happen very often, but yeah. Go ahead, Rich. So let's go through that annual colony cycle. I showed you that watercolor going left to right before. So here's a circular version by one of our colleagues, Jeremy Hemberger. So Rich, if you could advance one more time, we will start in late winter and we'll assume that the queen is underground hibernating. More on that in just a second. So when the weather turns, she's monitoring temperature cues and she comes out of the ground looking for something to eat. She's usually very hungry at this time. She's been underground for a month to as much as 9 months, depending on where they live, where she lives. So she must feed herself. Then she needs to find a place to start a nest. So go forward, Rich. We see her feeding on a dicentra there, a nice little squirrel corn, let's say. And maybe she's feeding herself nectar and eating some pollen so that she can fuel her flight and her other activities. She does find a nest site at some point. And go ahead to the next one. Yep. And so in this case, we are in a rodent burrow under a rock next to a log, or we're in the log, depending on the species. And so she lays eggs on top of that pollen mass that Rich described. So she's brought food home. She's provisioned that nest, and she lays her eggs right on top in a little waxy cup, and then she incubates it. She lays on top of it for most of the next 5 to 6 weeks. She will leave to forage for food for herself, but otherwise she's inside on top of those eggs. These animals are somewhere between warm-blooded and cold-blooded, more warm than cold. They can regulate their body temperature by burning calories internally, just as we do. They do not maintain homeostasis 98.6 Fahrenheit at all times. At times they'll conform to the environment. At other times they'll go above the ambient temperature. So she's generating heat and shunting that heat to her abdomen, where she's touching with the abdomen those eggs or those larvae and making them develop faster. So after the first the first workers come out, that queen will now stay home. And you can advance to the next one, Rich. And those workers will now do all of the other work. They'll do everything. The only thing the queen is now doing is laying eggs. Her daughters are feeding her. They are foraging. They are doing brood care, all the details of moving larvae from sac to sac and things like this. And the colony can grow exponentially at this stage. So when we get to the middle of summer, the next little image, this is when the colony has to decide at some magical point that it is time to stop making workforce and start making the reproductive offspring. So from an evolutionary sense, this whole colony the function of it is to get to this point where they can now make the reproductive offspring that they've cooperated to make. And so the queen starts laying eggs that are destined to become males. And she also lays eggs that instead of becoming workers, become a different female. They become the new reproductive females or queens. You will hear the word gyne sometimes, and that is a queen who is newly emerged from the nest. But I'm going to just say the new queens. And so if you go forward, that queen goes out into the world, finds a mate who is also out looking for mates. They mate. And then after this, as the weather changes and it becomes colder or perhaps drier if you're in Southern California or somewhere else like that, the colony will die. There's nothing left to eat. There is an accumulation of pathogens and other antagonists, perhaps, and everybody will die except those newly mated, newly produced queens, those gynes. And then going into winter, at this point, they do not stay in that nest hole. In fact, they go and they dig their own shallow hibernaculum. It can be 2 to 5 inches deep in my experience, often just below the root layer of grasses, if you could imagine a sod lawn. And then they bury themselves. And at this point, they conform their body temperature to the ambient, and they subsist on stored internal resources, a lot of fat and some stored nectar. And then they just wait there quietly. They can't move, they can't walk, they can't sting, they can't do anything until it's springtime and it's time to come out again. So if we go forward to the next slide, there is one other kind of bumblebee that we need to talk about. And I think it's one more click to get it to come in. There is one type of bumblebee that does not go through this rigmarole. Instead, they break into the nest of a host bumblebee, another species, and they attack that nest. They co-opt the social nature of that nest, and they force it to produce their offspring. So how this happens, we call them cuckoo bumblebees in reference to cuckoo birds, who also do something similar. This bee will emerge from hibernation late. She's not a queen, she's just a female. There's only one type of female in this species because they don't have a cooperative colony life cycle. Instead, they're parasites, and we only have males and females. So these females come out late, and then they go find an incipient, a young colony to attack. Some of them are specialized on just one species or two species of hosts, and others can use many different bumblebee hosts. They enter the nest when there's a small number of workers, not too small, not too large. They will fight with them. They will use pheromones and aggression to subjugate them. They kill all the eggs, all the larvae, and the resident queen usually survives, but it's just been described in papers as this cowering in the corner or sort of hiding in the dark on the edge of things. And then the workers are compelled to go out and forage, to come back and feed the offspring of the parasite who is now laying eggs, and feed the parasite. So the female of these cuckoos. They're really amazing animals. And at this point, some people will want to apply a value judgment, like, oh, these are parasites, they're bad, right? They're bumblebees, and they're doing what they do. This is one of the ways of making a living as a bumblebee, and it has been going on for literally for millions of years. In this lineage, they decided whatever they changed to a parasitic lifestyle long ago, and they are stuck with that. That is the only way they can reproduce. So go ahead forward to the next slide, and we'll hear. Oh, and one more just a little bit more about them. So they have adaptations through natural selection. They have developed these adaptations for that life cycle that are kind of distinctive for this group of bumblebees. They have an especially large set of mouth parts or mandibles. They're blocky and large. Their exoskeleton is distinctly thick. In fact, if you're an entomologist who has to kill insects and pin them for your research and you have killed one of these, it is hard to stick a pin through it. It's so thick and strong. And we think this is an adaptation for fighting with with the host. The hosts have various ways of responding to this. They will sting and try to kill that interloper. They also do this thing called honey daubing, where they will take stored nectar resources from the nest and spit them all over the cuckoo bumblebee in hopes of making her go away. So fascinating stuff, and these guys, you can see them with the other bumblebees around North America when you're out there looking at bumblebees. Okay, so I am going to talk about four basic categories of things that bumblebees need in their life history or their ecology. I'm going to talk about the first of these, places to forage, and then I'll hand it over to Jenny, who will start talking about nests and other things. So we like to organize the needs of bumblebees into these four categories. They need food. Food comes from plants. Bumblebees eat pollen and nectar, with just a few weird exceptions from other parts of the world. It's gotta be flowers. So the arrangement of flowers, the identity of the species of the flowers, the abundance of nectar and pollen in those flowers. So the plant's condition relative to drought or rainfall or cold or whatever. These things are all very important to foraging. They need nest sites. And so I've described what those nest sites are like. And Jenny is our expert on this, and she'll tell you much more about that. But this is a potentially limiting factor in the life of a bumblebee. She must find a good place to live. Places to mate. The ecology of mating or mate location in bumblebees is actually really interesting. Different groups of bumblebees do it differently. So we'll hear about that. And then, as I said, they hibernate. They hibernate below ground, and they have to dig a little tunnel and bury themselves. And so this is an interesting place where particular conditions might be better for them to survive the winter or worse for them to survive the winter. So let's talk about forage. All right. So the first thing to know about bumblebees is that they are dietary generalists. We typically say they're generalists, and by that, in the world of entomologists, we specifically mean pollen generalists. So that means that they can take their pollen from hundreds, in fact, thousands of different types of plants. They can eat pollen that's yellow, pollen that's blue, pollen with plant chemicals in it, and pollen without plant chemicals in it. They have a Catholic diet where pollen is concerned. In fact, they're the same with nectar. They can eat many different types of nectar. And this is important because it gives them flexibility on the landscape, let's say. Pollen is the primary source of protein for bees, and all animals must have protein to reproduce. And this is actually the distinctive thing that makes a bee a bee. Bees eat pollen for their protein. They, with a few weird exceptions, they do not eat animal protein. And so we could say they're vegans or at least vegetarians. They consume some microbes, but that's another story. And so plants are incredibly important to them because pollen is limiting on reproduction, right? So that is where they get their protein. Nectar is primarily the carbohydrate source, and they're getting fats from pollen. They're getting some other micronutrients and a whole bunch of other weird exotic plant chemicals from some of this stuff. Um, and adults flying around the landscape, nectar is probably what is fueling that flight. Most of the flight is fueled by breaking down sugars in the diet, right? Um, I want to just say before we move on, despite them being generalists, extreme generalists in terms of other bees, each of these species might have particular dietary preferences. And so we should remember that if we're talking about bumblebees in general, the plant list is thousands of lines long. If we're talking about one particular species, it's going to be a distinct subset, overlapping with other species, but they definitely have preferences wherever by species. So go ahead to the next. All right. So there's some interesting stuff that affects bumblebee foraging behavior, and we'll present just a few of these here. One is tongue length. So how long is the tongue? And you can see how tongue length would affect their ability to forage in flowers. If the flower was very long and you had a very short tongue, you could not get to the base of the flower to get the nectar, right? And so here we see the rusty patch bumblebee on the left with a comparatively short tongue, the tongue being that sort of pink salmon colored tubular thing sticking out of the face. And then on the right, we see Bombus fervidus, or the golden northern bumblebee. Also, California bumblebee is under this moniker. And it's got a much longer tongue, which is partially covered by some other mouth parts in this image, but it's just quite a bit longer, probably about twice as long as that of the rusty patch. These two bees have overlapping dietary needs, but they also have distinct abilities to get at flowers, nectar in flowers of different sizes. So those tongue lengths range from about 5 to 12 millimeters total. This varies by species, as I've just said. It also varies by body size. So within each species, we see variation. And this stuff redounds to the foraging behavior of the animals on the landscape. We can see pattern based on the tongue length when we're watching bees. There's a really fascinating study that shows that this tongue length can evolve on relatively short timescales. The timescale here is 40 years between a study done in, I think, the 1970s in the Front Range of the Colorado Rockies, and then a resurvey of the same sites 40 years later found that bumblebees had significantly shorter tongues because drought, it was climate related, climate change related, had changed the composition of the plants that the bees could forage on. And so bees with shorter tongues reproduce better. They were more able to get food more efficiently. They brought in more food per unit time, and they made more offspring. So go ahead to the next slide, please. So there's this complex thing that we see in nature where bumblebees have tongues both long and short, and flowers come in a variety of sizes. So the one on the left is you can't tell from the photo, but that is a Western bumblebee, a short-tongued individual sitting on a flower with very long corolla tubes. Those sticks, those pointy things coming off the back of the flowers, that's the nectary. And the nectar's all the way down at the bottom. So you can see it's almost as long as the bee's body. And this bee, she cannot reach that nectar. More on that in just a minute. The other two photos, you see two other species of bees. Bombus terricola or yellow-belted bumblebee at the top, and then Vosnesensky bumblebee, and they're both foraging on flowers with very shallow corollas, just quite small and very easy to reach the bottom. And the graph here just shows the image, the graphic from a paper is just showing you that for some plant species, the nectar is hidden far away from where the bee enters the flower, and this limits who can pollinate the flower, who can visit and take food out. So go ahead to this next slide. And here's data from another paper. I'm going to go through this quickly because I'm short on time. But this is 6 species of bumblebees from one Colorado Rockies field site, and they're ordered from the one with the smallest tongue at the top to the one with the longest tongue at the bottom. They're all co-occurring. They're all foraging on the same set of 8 or 10 plants, which you see across the horizontal axis. And the size, the vertical size of these red bars is just relative frequency in the observations. So if the bar is higher, it means the observer saw more instances of that bee on that plant. And the point I want to make to you here is that the small-tongued bumblebees, on average, are using flowers with relatively shorter corollas. The flowers on the left side are the smallest, the flowers on the right side are the longest. And then by contrast, the bee with the longest tongue at the bottom is spending most of its time on the flowers with the longest corollas. So mix that with the fact that each species has different sizes of bees, you get all of this complexity, but you see some resource partitioning there where different bees are coexisting and they're mostly avoiding each other by segmenting out into those little floral length niches. Go ahead and advance. So two other things about foraging behavior with bumblebees, and we have a short little video here showing a rusty patch bumblebee cheating cheating on this nice little story that I just told you. This bumblebee is making holes in the base of this bee balm flower to get the nectar rather than going through the front door, if you will, of the flower, because her tongue is too small for her to reach the nectar. She just rips a hole in the flower and gets the nectar that way. So remember that pollination is incidental to the bees foraging. It's not altruism. And so the bees are just trying to forage as efficiently as possible. And some short-tongued bees are really good at getting nectar from long corolla flowers by doing this. It's called nectar robbing. Let's move on to the next slide. And we want to also introduce you to this really cool foraging behavior that bumblebees have. We call it buzz pollination. There's a whole series of flowers that they sonicate to get the flower out of the pollen out of. And here is a solanum flower. And the bee is holding onto it. This is a slow motion video. And she's vibrating the flower at high frequency, and the pollen is raining out of these parietal or pore opening anthers. And other bees cannot get in to get that pollen if they cannot sonicate the flower. So this is an adaptation of the plant and an adaptation of the bee that meets both of their needs in this pollination mutualism. And so the last slide that I will talk about shows just that the pattern in the world of plants that do this. So things like tomatoes, peppers, blueberries, cranberries, they are all better pollinated by an insect that can buzz them or sonicate them. And there's more on this list as well. So it's widespread in nature. Bumblebees excel at doing this thing. And this is one way that they're good at extracting pollen from flowers. So now I will pass it on to Jenny. And she is going to talk about places to nest.
Thank you, Leaf. Rich, you can just go ahead and continue to advance the slides. That would be awesome. So for this next part of the talk, I am going to walk you through some of the other types of resources that bumblebees need from their habitats. Before we dive in, I really want to emphasize there is a lot that we don't know about bumblebee nesting, overwintering, and mating. It's really hard to find bumblebee nests. It's really hard to find mating pairs, and it's hard to find overwintering sites. But we're going to talk about what we do know, and we'll start off with places to nest. So you can go ahead and advance, Rich. And then advance one more time. All right, so where do bumblebees nest? As Leaf mentioned, bumblebees need a cavity to nest in. They're not building their nest sites themselves. They're relying on existing structures for their nest sites. So bumblebees need a shelter, and they also need some sort of insulative material so that they can keep their brood at the correct temperature. Places like rodent burrows or nests, bird nests or birdhouses, and tree stumps and rotten logs and hollow trees are all great spots for bumblebees to nest in. They also will use more anthropogenic environments, so places like compost piles, wall insulation. I think I saw somebody posted in the chat that they found a bumblebee nest in their garage and some blankets. They also use more human-centered environments as well. Bumblebees are what we call nesting habitat generalists. They aren't necessarily stuck with one type of structure. They can use lots of different places to nest. But we do see some species-specific differences in where they will nest. Rich, if you could advance, that would be great. Right, so most of the time when we find bumblebee nests, we're finding them below the ground. So in places like rodent burrows or chipmunk burrows, the vast majority of the time, this is where bumblebees are nesting. And there are some species that we generally see almost all the time below the ground. Common eastern bumblebee is a species we see below ground quite often. Rusty patch bumblebee is another below ground nesting species. Go ahead, Rich. The size of these underground cavities can be very different. Some cavities are pretty shallow, they're a few, 6 inches below the ground. But rodent tunnels can be quite extensive. And if you've ever been at a nest excavation, that's what you see pictured here is some scientists digging up a bumblebee nest. You realize really quickly how deep these tunnels can go and how big of an area that they can spread out. I helped excavate a nest once a few years ago, and I could literally lay in the hole that we dug out because it was just such a huge area. So what's going on below the ground? Like there can be a lot of space down there for bumblebees. If you want to go ahead to the next slide. So as Leaf mentioned, some bumblebee species tend to nest on the surface of the ground. And what I mean by surface nesting is that the bee's colony is resting on the surface of the ground, or it's just slightly embedded in the ground, and then it's covered up by a sort of roof made out of vegetation. Oftentimes this will be grass, or sometimes it can be moss, and that roof is watertight. There's not a lot of moisture getting into it. It's basically a little bee bungalow. Most of the time, these are nests of rodents, so things like meadow voles that build sort of grassy nests that the bees can then co-opt and use. So species like yellow bumblebee and American bumblebee and brown-belted bumblebee will often be found nesting on the surface of the ground. And then we also find bumblebee nests above the ground, so in places like bird nests or in hollow trees. There's actually a species of bumblebee in Europe called the tree bumblebee. One of the reasons it's called the tree bumblebee is because it nests quite often above the ground. It's often found in old tree hollows. This is, I think, an area where we don't have a lot of research. We don't find bumblebee nests above the ground very often, but it could be because those aren't really where bumblebees nest, or it could be because it's really hard to find bumblebee nests in trees. There's a lot we don't know about above ground nesting, but they definitely nest above the ground sometimes, and some species tend to nest above the ground more than others. Go ahead, Rich. I want to show you a short video of what a bumblebee nest looks like from the outside. So here we see two worker bumblebees emerging from the nest entrance. This is actually a rusty patch bumblebee nest. So you see that second worker fly off there. Right, so when you're looking for nest sites or you think you spot a nest, a lot of the time what you're going to be queuing in on is worker activity outside of the nest entrance. You're not going to be necessarily looking for that substrate because it can be hard to find. Bumblebees can be sensitive to predation at nests. Go ahead, Rich. Sorry, you can go back. So as you can imagine, all of that larva and those nectar pots are going to be a really attractive source of food for big predators like skunks and bears. And every once in a while, you might encounter a nest that has been predated. So pictured here is a red-belted bumblebee nest that has gotten eaten up. The workers and the queen are still hanging out in the nest, but all of the larvae and all of the nectar pots and everything else has gotten eaten. You can move to the next slide, Rich. One way that we can learn more about bumblebee nesting is by looking at the behaviors of nest-searching queen bumblebees. So bumblebee queens, when they emerge from their overwintering quarters in the spring and start looking for a nest site, exhibit this really distinctive behavior where they'll fly really low to the ground in a zigzag pattern, or they'll fly sort of up and down tree trunks looking for a nest site. So if you see bumblebees doing that, that means that they are probably looking for a nest site, which is really cool. By looking at where we're seeing these nest searching queens, we can make some um, inferences about where they like to nest. You can go ahead to the next slide, Rich. All right, so next I'm going to talk about places that bumblebees mate. All right, so where do bumblebees find mates? That really depends on the species. Different species of bumblebees display different types of courtship behaviors. So some bumblebee species will do what we call patrolling and scent marking. So basically, they'll fly around in a big circle. The males will just stop down on leaves and vegetation every so often and scent mark and try to attract queens to the area. We'll also see males perching. So if you can move to the next slide, Rich. That is the behavior that you see pictured there. The male bumblebee will sit up on a really tall piece of vegetation looking for queen bumblebees flying by, and when they spot something that looks like a queen bumblebee, they'll fly off in hot pursuit. And you can go to the next slide, Rich. We'll show you guys a video of what that looks like. This is in slow-mo, so this behavior is quite speedy if you see it in real time, so we've slowed it down a little bit so you guys can view it. This male is hanging out looking for a queen, and he spots something that looks like it could be a queen and then flies off in hot pursuit. And sometimes that could be because he sees a bird or a bumblebee or something else fly by. They're not super picky when it comes to being triggered into doing that pursuit. Rich, you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. All right, and the next mating behavior that I want to talk is nest entrance waiting. So male bumblebees sometimes will, instead of looking for females that have already emerged from their nests out in the environment, will find a nest itself and then wait outside the entrance for queens to come out, or sometimes they'll even go inside the nest to mate with queens. Rich, you can go to the next slide. So for some species, mating can occur near or in the nest. And what that means is that mating habitat can be one and the same as nesting habitat. For other species that aren't mating in the nest, sometimes you'll see mating pairs on the ground or mating on vegetation. It's really neat to see when the males emerge. Shortly after that, you might once in a while see a mating pair, but it's a really neat event. It's pretty rare, so if you do see it, be sure to snap a picture. That's super cool. Okay, go ahead, Rich. All right, so the last place that we're going to talk about that bumblebees need are places to overwinter. So as Leaf mentioned, bumblebee queens are digging out their own hibernacula, so their own place to spend the winter. And usually this is not very deep. So sometimes it might just be an inch or two in the soil or right underneath the leafy duff on like the forest floor. There does seem to be some association with north-facing slopes for bumblebees overwintering. And there have been a few instances where bumblebees have been recorded overwintering colonially. So some species of bumblebees, or I should just say one species of bumblebees, the common eastern bumblebee, the queens will actually overwinter in aggregations really close to their natal nest sites. So you can find lots of queen bumblebees in just a small area, but there's only one species that has been recorded to do that to my knowledge. And if you want to move to the next slide, Rich, we're going to show you a short video of what it looks like to see a queen bumblebee excavating a hibernacula. So this queen, she's right next to that big silver tag, is digging out with her legs her own hibernacula. So she's going to dig out this little spot, over the course of maybe a day or two. And then once she is ready to overwinter, she is just going to bury herself there, and that is where she's going to spend a huge amount of her life. So, half of her life or more, depending on where she is in the environment. If she's in Minnesota, bumblebees spend quite a lot of time in overwintering quarters, which is really interesting because there's so much we don't know about where they spend their winter, yet they're spending so much of their lives there. Okay, go ahead, Rich. All right, so as I mentioned previously, there is so much we don't know about these habitat needs of these animals during these more cryptic stages of their life cycle. Where bumblebees nest in general, how land management is impacting their nesting. Can colonies survive periods of extreme heat? Um, there's a lot we don't know about hibernation. For many species, we don't even know where they hibernate, especially for many Western species in the Western US. There's a lot we don't know about queen and male dispersal, about reproduction. There's just a huge black box when it comes to understanding these parts of the bumblebee's life cycle, which if you want to go ahead and advance. So that is where you guys can step in and help us out. If you are a participant in the Atlas, or if you're just somebody who uses iNaturalist or Bumblebee Watch to post your incidental observations, if you see bumblebees doing something really interesting, be sure to make a note of it. You have the option to do that in Bumblebee Watch, which if you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide. If you post an observation to Bumblebee Watch, you can make a note on what interesting behaviors you see in the field. So if you spot a bumblebee mating, instead of just posting the photo, you can record that that was a mating pair, and that helps scientists figure out what observations represent things like mating and overwintering and nesting. Rich, if you want to advance to the next slide. You can also make notes on things like predation. So I mentioned that bumblebees can be predated at their nest sites. They can also be predated while they're out on flowers by things like spiders and robber flies and all sorts of critters. So if you see a bumblebee being predated, that's another thing that you can note when you are posting an observation to an app like Bumblebee Watch or iNaturalist. Rich, you can go ahead and advance. You can also post information about parasites. So most of the time when bumblebees are parasitized by something, that parasite's not going to be visible to the naked eye, but there are some things like mites and other critters on the bees that you might note as you are observing bumblebees in the field, and you can make a note of that as well. Go ahead, Rich. Okay. And the last thing I want to talk about is nest observations, because in Bumblebee Watch, there's a special option for posting nest observations. If you see a bumblebee nest, it's a big deal. It's a really special type of observation. And you can go to Bumblebee Watch and not just post your photos, but tell us other information about the nest. So what sort of position the nest is in? Is it on the surface of the ground? Is it below the ground? Is it above the ground? Information about that surrounding habitat and colony activity, nest traffic, and all that information is stuff that we can use to help us learn more about these phases of the life cycle for these bees. And I think that wraps up my section.
Yep, that's the last slide for you, Jenny.
All right, I think that means it is my turn, and I can share slides, Rich.
Okay, I will stop.
Rich, are you seeing slides? Is it presenter mode and everything? Okay.
You look good.
Okay, awesome. Thanks to Rich and Leaf and Jenny for getting us started with the ecology of bumblebees. And now we're going to dive into the second part of tonight's webinar, where Michelle, Katie, and I will share the story of bumblebee declines, the threats they face, conservation efforts that are underway, what we can all do to help, and the incredible positive impact that Bumblebee Atlas volunteers like you are making. So bumblebee research and observations have been occurring for a long time. We have bumblebee specimens in natural history museums going back into the 1800s. For many years, entomologists went out and collected and studied these fascinating animals, learning about their diversity, their habitats, their distribution, and the life cycles, some of the things that we just heard about. But starting in the early to mid 1990s, some researchers across the globe started to notice that they weren't seeing certain species of once common bumblebees in the places that they expected them to be. It turns out that there were 4 species that seemed to be experiencing significant declines. These were the western bumblebee, Franklin's bumblebee, the yellow-banded bumblebee, and the rusty patch bumblebee. A puzzling fact about the observed declines was that these 4 species have very different ranges. The western bumblebee was widely distributed across the western United States and Canada. Franklin's bumblebee had a very small range, known only from northern California and southern Oregon. The yellow-banded bumblebee's range stretched from the East Coast, south through Appalachia, and then north and west through the northern plains into Canada. And the rusty patch bumblebee was known from New England west to the northern plains and south down through Georgia. Maybe a less puzzling fact that stands out is that these 4 species are closely related. We classify them currently into the same subgenus, and this relatedness led to the hypothesis that the declines possibly had a biological cause, and we now think that pathogens were a major factor in these declines. Unfortunately, these 4 species were not the only ones found to be in decline around that time. So the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, formed the Bumblebee Specialist Group. This group of experts currently is made up of more than 70 scientists in 10 regions around the globe. The goal of the Bumblebee Specialist Group is to complete research to better understand the extinction risk of bumblebees worldwide. In North America, the Bumblebee Specialist Group is made up of leading bumblebee experts, including several Xerces staff members. They got to work early in the 2000s on this formal process of conducting species status assessments for all North American bumblebees. The process that they followed is standardized. It's a standardized evaluation process using historical data from museum specimens and scientific literature, and the goal is to evaluate each species' risk of extinction. About 10 years ago, these species status assessments were finished, and this graph kind of summarizes the result. I like to start with the green, with the good news. Of the 46 species assessed, 28 of them, over half, were ranked as species of least concern. These are species whose populations seem to be stable. The big news was the 25% of species that landed in one of the at-risk categories, from 4 considered critically endangered, 2 considered endangered, and 6 ranked as vulnerable or near threatened. There were also 5 species on which there wasn't enough data to make an assessment. We classify them as data deficient. So we don't really know what's going on with those rare bumblebees. We should consider the possibility that they could be in one of these threatened categories, especially since many of the data deficient species are those species known from high elevations or high latitudes, and they're the ones that are experiencing some dramatic changes in climate and habitat. So which are the species that are at risk? This list shows the 12 North American bumblebee species facing some risk of extinction. Some of these, like American bumblebee and yellow bumblebee, are known from across the entire US. Others, like the rusty patch bumblebee and western bumblebee, have historic ranges across just the eastern US or the western US. And some species have much narrower ranges, like just along the Pacific coast, or in the case of Franklin's bumblebee, only in that small area of California and Oregon. 3 of our most imperiled species haven't been observed in the US for years. As far as we know, the Suckley cuckoo was last seen in 2016, the variable cuckoo was last seen in 2013, and Franklin's bumblebee was last seen in 2006. Our bumblebee team is hopeful that these species are still out there somewhere, and efforts like the Bumblebee Atlas can hopefully help us find where they are. All of these species have been petitioned for endangered species protection. The U.S. Endangered Species Act of 1973 was created to protect at-risk species and develop plans to help populations recover. The law provides a framework to conserve and protect endangered species and their habitats. So when a species gets listed as endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a multi-state effort is undertaken, and the ultimate goal of listing species is to help populations recover. The Rusty Patch Bumblebee made headlines in 2017 when it became the first bee to be listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. Franklin's bumblebee got endangered species protection in 2022, and in January of last year, 2025, the Suckly cuckoo bumblebee has been proposed for an endangered species listing. Other species are still under review by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we know that these species are in decline, but what is causing these declines? What are those threats that are negatively impacting bumblebees? There's not really a simple answer to this question. A lot of work is being done to better understand the cause of bumblebee declines, and expert consensus is that there's several factors working together to negatively impact these animals. And while we can't get into all insects today, it's important to note that it's not just bumblebee populations that are declining. These factors are negatively impacting many insects all across the globe. 5 key threats that we'll talk about today are habitat loss, pathogens, pesticides, competition from commercial bees, and climate change. One important factor that's impacting bumblebee populations is habitat loss and fragmentation. Bumblebee colonies need flowers from early spring when queens emerge from hibernation until fall when those new queens are preparing to overwinter. They also need safe places to nest, cavities like hollow logs, abandoned rodent burrows, or rock piles, and queens need loose bare soil or leaf litter for overwintering. Intact habitat, like what we see in this picture from Nebraska, can provide those essential habitat features. Unfortunately, human activity over past decades has drastically eliminated a lot of bumblebee habitat. Cities, roads, large agricultural fields, and even suburbs have replaced diverse native landscapes. And when you think about it, both farms and suburban gardens could provide food and nesting sites and overwintering sites, but these can be some high-risk environments for bumblebees due to frequent disturbances, a lack of diverse food resources, and exposure to pesticides. Additionally, when habitat is fragmented, populations can become isolated, leading to reduced genetic diversity. Pesticides are another factor harming bumblebees. Our landscapes are full of chemicals. There's herbicides and fungicides and insecticides, and all of these chemicals can cause harm to bumblebees and other native pollinators. There are several ways that bumblebees can be impacted by pesticides. The obvious one is direct exposure, when a chemical lands directly on the bee itself. Another type of exposure is residue contact. This occurs when a bee forages on a flower that has been previously treated by pesticides or has been contaminated by pesticide drifting from the place where it was applied into an adjoining area. And remember that bumblebees nest underground, or as we heard, in bunch grasses or brush piles or rock piles. So when pesticides get sprayed into an environment, you could also be contaminating nest sites. Clearly, all of these situations are not going to be good for the bees. If the chemicals don't outright kill them, there can be what we call sublethal effects. Maybe the queen is not as healthy and can't lay as many eggs. Maybe the workers are less healthy and can't forage as effectively. Or maybe the bees' immune systems are compromised, so they're less able to fight off other pathogens. Any of these things or all of these things can lead to population declines. One particularly troubling group of pesticides are systemic insecticides. When a systemic insecticide is applied, it's taken up through the plant's root and transported to all parts of the plant, making all or most of that plant toxic. These types of insecticides typically are aimed at plant-feeding insects that people consider pests, like aphids. But remember that insecticides are created to kill insects. That means that all the insects will be affected, those that are considered pests and also beneficial insects like bumblebees. Pollen and nectar produced by a plant treated with systemic insecticides can become contaminated with these chemicals, harming or killing the bees that forage on them. We know that pesticides are harmful to bumblebees and other pollinators, and we know that these chemicals are widely used in agriculture, industry, and in homes and gardens. Tests have found pesticide contamination in honeybee pollen and in stream samples across the United States. Still, there's a lot we don't know about how these chemicals affect bumblebees and other native bees, because historically the effects of chemicals like the traditional chemicals as well as newer pesticides claiming to be safe for bees. They've only been tested on honeybees. And that practice overlooks the impact of contaminated soil on ground nesting bees like bumblebees. We also have really limited data on the use of pesticides, especially in homes and gardens, making research into their impacts even more challenging. Another threat affecting bumblebees is disease. Just like any other organism, bumblebees can get sick, infected with pathogens or parasites. Compounding the diseases are stressors like lack of quality food resources and pesticides, which may lower their immunity and make it harder for them to fight off diseases. This is, again, another ongoing area of research, and there's still a lot left to learn. Some pathogens are listed here, including fungal and protist parasites, and viruses like deformed wing virus and black queen cell virus. Researchers have also discovered that honeybees are able to spread their pathogens, their germs, to wild bumblebee populations when they're out foraging in the same area. So that's also something to be aware of. Another concern related to disease is the rearing of commercial bumblebee colonies to support pollination in greenhouses. These commercially raised bumblebees can easily escape greenhouses and be found foraging on plants in the surrounding areas, leading to competition with native bees and the spread of diseases that may have been amplified in the commercial facility. Despite these concerns, this industry, this commercial bumblebee industry, is not regulated in most of the US and Canada. Another threat affecting bumblebee populations is competition from commercial honeybees. Honeybees are not native to North America, and nearly all hives in the US are managed by humans, though feral colonies are possible, especially in warmer climates. Honeybees face similar threats and challenges as bumblebees, but they're not endangered. There are millions of honeybee hives in North America, and each colony can be 15,000 to 50,000, sometimes even 80,000 individuals. These colonies can cause a huge amount of competition with native bees, especially in landscapes with limited floral resources. Due to a lot of attention from the press and a lot of us learning about honeybees as children, they're kind of the poster children for bee pollination. We also depend on honeybees in our current agricultural practices, so they're really important. So because of these things, they're kind of famous bees, and the challenges that beekeepers face are pretty well known. The diseases that they face, you may have heard of colony collapse disorder. These challenges are so well known, in fact, that many people have tried to quote unquote save the bees by setting up their own honeybee hives. We just need to be clear that honeybees are important and they're fascinating for many reasons, but beekeeping is not a way to help wild native bees. In fact, when there's too many beehives in a landscape or when hives are not well cared for, that hive can be harmful to all the bees in the area by spreading pathogens and increasing competition. The final threat I'm going to talk about today is climate change. We are witnessing drastic changes in climate, resulting in drought and extreme extended heat waves. These phenomena are not good for bumblebees either. Drought means there aren't as many flowers on the landscape, which means there's limited food availability and more competition between bees that are in the area. When spring comes early and winters are very mild, like many of us in the West experienced this past winter, there may be a mismatch between the timing of flower blooms and the bee life cycle. And the large fuzzy bodies of bumblebees we heard already earlier makes them better suited to cooler climates, which means they suffer during extended periods of extremely high temperatures. So extreme high temperatures can certainly kill bumblebee individuals and bumblebee colonies, but heat waves can also have a number of other negative effects, including shorter lifespan, lower reproductive success, smaller bodies, less efficient foraging, and resilience to heat stress can vary by species and be impacted by other biological factors, other environmental factors. These images here display the results of a 2015 study that showed that climate change is making some southern parts of bumblebee ranges too hot for them to live in. At that same time, species that lose habitat at lower elevations shift their ranges to higher elevations, but alpine bumblebee species are kind of stuck. They can't move any higher than where they already are. So in the northern parts of their ranges, we're in danger of losing high elevation species, and in the southern parts of their ranges, we're in danger of losing low elevation species. All this means that climate change is causing range shifts, less biodiversity, and local extirpations. And once again, there's still a lot we don't know. The Bumblebee Atlas is helping us learn about current ranges and habitats and will provide baseline data sets as we monitor populations into the future. Our Bumblebee Atlas work can also support and inform the variety of research being done to help us better understand all the unknowns of bumblebee ecology and conservation. So now that I've shared all this rather dismal information, I'm going to pass it off to Michelle, who's going to share some reasons for hope and actions that we can all take to help our local bumblebee populations.
Thanks, Amy. I'll go ahead and share my slides.
Okay. You should have it control.
Okay, Amy, can you see those slides okay?
Yep, it looks good.
Okay, great. So a lot of the threats that Amy mentioned, these are challenges that we as humans have created, but there's also a lot of hope for solutions that we can implement for positive change. So I'll be sharing with you some of the actions that you can take to make a difference for bumblebee conservation. So there's 4 components to building habitat for bumblebees that I'll be covering today. Planting flowers and providing food for bees is the easiest single action that you can take to help bumblebees. But habitat is a lot more than just flowers. We need to think about providing shelter for bumblebees by protecting their overwintering and nesting sites. As a community, we need to think about connecting bee habitat, and we need to provide a non-toxic environment for bumblebees. So my yard used to be a weedy lawn. I decided to kill the grass and plant a diversity of flowers in my yard. These sunflowers and Rocky Mountain bee plants just dominated the yard, growing over 6 feet tall. If you look closely, you can even see some bumblebees on some of the flowers. There were times that the yard would be loudly buzzing with bee activity. One of my favorite hobbies is sipping my coffee and just seeing which pollinators had shown up for the day. So if you plant flowers, the bees will definitely find them. So since we have people from all over the country, I'm interested to hear from you all. What are some of your favorite flowers to plant for bees? Feel free to drop your answers in the chat, include your state so people can learn from you. And let me just access the chat here. Yeah, so we have a lot of gardeners, we have a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge about this. So hopefully we can learn from one another through the chat, but I'm going to keep moving through the slides here. Okay, so bees don't just need any flowers, they need the right nutrition all season long. So nectar provides sugars. This fuels adult bees for flight and daily activity. And pollen provides protein and fat. So this is critical for larval growth, egg production, and overall colony health. Pollen's the only source of protein for bees, which you've heard already tonight. Flowers range anywhere from 2 to 60% protein and 1 to 20% fat. So with low nutrition flowers, they're the equivalent of the bee junk food, and they just don't provide adequate nutrition from that species alone. So plant diversity is so important for bumblebees. It helps meet their nutritional needs across the season. So when you're creating pollinator habitat, select plants that have overlapping bloom times from spring to fall. For early spring flowers, trees and shrubs are typically the first to bloom and can be valuable additions to your landscaping. You can think about creating a system with diverse colors, shapes, and sizes across spring, summer, and fall. Spring is a critical period for bumblebees as queens are in their solitary phase and require adequate nutrition to establish a healthy colony. In warm springs, bumblebees may emerge days before plants start flowering as the soil warms up more quickly than air temperatures. This is another reason to plant diverse, early season flowers in your yard to provide access to hungry queens when they emerge. Flowers for bumblebees can also be scarce in the fall, so in order to survive the winter, queens need adequate energy stores. Having a diversity of late season flowers, like a lot of goldenrods and asters or other native plants that you know well in your area, these can all help bees build up their reserves. So if you're just getting started providing habitat for pollinators, remember there's a spectrum of possibilities, starting by taking small actions and going as far as converting a lawn to a full native plant habitat. You don't have to go from 0 to 100 to make a difference. Every single step along the spectrum is important. Maybe you start mowing less, maybe you add a few native plants or a native tree or shrub, or stop using chemicals. So the great part is you don't need to do this all at once. Do what you can little by little and figure out what works for you. These beneficial practices aren't about doing more, it's actually about doing less work. Less mowing, less tidying, fewer chemicals, less water. It's about making our landscapes less manicured and more welcoming to wildlife. So from community gardens to container gardens to adding strips of wildflowers to your yard, these are all making a huge difference for pollinators. So a few considerations for selecting plants. Garden varieties are often bred for characteristics desirable to humans, not to bees. So just because it blooms doesn't mean that it necessarily provides pollen or nectar, as shown here with this primrose, which just doesn't offer a lot for bees. So other good examples of flowers that don't provide food for bees are pansies and carnations. Some varieties and hybrids have been bred for double petals, which loses the plant's ability to produce nectar or pollen. So think about flowers from the perspective of the bees as well. When choosing plants for pollinator habitat, I recommend prioritizing native species. They're adapted to our local climate and soils, and they support a much wider range of insects. I also want to say I understand that gardening is very personal and people have prize flowers they've been planting for years. Non-native plants can still play a role, especially if they're non-invasive and if they provide nectar or pollen. Things like herbs, lavender, zinnias, or poppies can still be attractive to pollinators or serve other purposes in your yard, like maybe you just like to have them around. But in general, native plants will support a large number of pollinator species and a diversity of wildlife with reduced input. These plants are equipped to survive stressors like drought, severe winters, poor soils without extra care. So gardening with native plants is a rewarding way that we can provide wildlife habitat. If you need help finding sources for native plants, visit Xerces Native Plant Directory. This QR code will take you there. So many local communities host native plant sales in the spring, such as this event in May in my little town of Livingston, which is hosted by a local nonprofit. So we know that flowers are necessary to fuel bumblebees, but we need to think beyond flowers and provide shelter. Queens need to establish a new nest in the spring and find suitable locations to overwinter. So this wild landscape shown here provides many options for shelter, but what can we do at our home scale to increase nesting and overwintering sites for bumblebees? For a queen to find a suitable nest, she'll choose abandoned rodent burrows, rock piles, or nests at the base of bunch grasses. So brush piles provide habitat for a variety of animals, including small mammals whose burrows provide the perfect nesting location for bumblebees. If you or your neighbors don't love the view of a brush pile, think about building it in the back corner of your yard or building a brush fence. Rock stacks and rock piles provide protected cavities for bumblebees to nest in, such as this dry stacked wall. Check out the recent Xerces blog, Wildlife on the Rocks, for a great read about the importance of rocks for habitat. And some bumblebee species nest above ground at the base of bunch grasses. So a lot of times for selecting plants for our pollinator gardens, we forget about grasses. So remember the value of native bunch grasses for nesting bumblebees. So generally doing less work in the fall is going to be better for bumblebees to overwinter. New queens will bury themselves in dirt, leaves, compost piles, or overgrown areas. It's helpful to delay cutting back old plants until the spring rather than doing it in the fall, and just generally being less tidy. For a short read, I recommend Xerces' Nesting and Overwintering Habitat Guide found on our website. With habitat connectivity, we often think about the movement of large mammals like migrating elk or bears, especially where I live in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. But connected habitat is just as important for bumblebees for genetic diversity and availability of food and shelter. In urban areas like this photo of Sacramento, suitable bumblebee habitat is often limited to areas along rivers, parks, and other locations, but we can act to create additional habitat and connect patches through corridors. So the food and the shelter that you provide for bees in your yard and your friend's yard or a community garden and parks, these all provide access for bumblebees to connect patches of habitat to wild spaces. And if you're going to go through all the work of providing habitat for bumblebees, the last thing you want to do is to kill them. Home gardeners love to buy insecticides. This figure shown here shows the comparison of home garden use in gray compared to agricultural use of insecticides in black, with more money spent on home and garden use than on farms. Insecticides aren't regulated for home use, meaning that people could use higher concentrations or use them more frequently than recommended. In the majority of homes and gardens, chemical pesticides are simply not needed. Plants that you buy at the nursery may be treated with pesticides and you might not even know it, so it's important to check your sources. Plants treated with systemic insecticides like neonicotinoids means that the pollen and the nectar will be contaminated with the insecticide, and for perennials, this can last in the tissue of the plant for months or even years. Our pesticide team has a great informative webinar on this topic, and we also have a free guide about buying bee-safe plants if you want to learn more. The Xerces Society approach to pest management is to examine the system as a whole. So increasing biodiversity and creating habitat can boost natural pest control and reduce the reliance on pesticides. Another way to approach pests is through a slight attitude change by recognizing that your garden plants will be chewed, nested in, dug out, and burrowed in, which is generally a great thing for beneficial insects. I encourage you to get curious and watch what critters show up in your yard. If you want to learn which species you can plant for pollinators and beneficial insects, Xerces has free region-specific guides to help you get started. And you can find all of these resources at xerces.org/publications. If you have more questions, Xerces is here to help. In addition to the resources that I've mentioned, we have a vast library of publications, so spend some time on this website, sift through and see what's available, because if you have a question, Xerces has probably thought of it too and likely answered it. So to quickly recap, to help contribute to bumblebee conservation, you can plant flowers, especially native plants that bloom from spring to fall. You can provide nesting and overwintering habitat by generally delaying fall cleanup and leaving some untidy areas in your yard. You can help connect landscapes by encouraging your friends and family to provide pollinator habitat. And finally, you can provide a non-toxic environment by reducing or eliminating the use of pesticides. So as a community, we can work together to provide pollinator habitat in multiple locations like roadsides, in parks, in farms and yards, which adds up to making a huge difference for bees. There's one more very important action that you can take for bumblebee conservation, and that's getting involved in community science programs like the Bumble Bee Atlas. So this map shows your impact since the start of the Bumble Bee Atlas by building this extensive data set in the states that we currently have Atlas programs. So with the addition of New Mexico this year, I'm excited to see this map continue to grow. So thank you so much for being a part of this work. Now I'll pass it over to Katie to share with you more about the impacts of the Bumble Bee Atlas program. Katie, do you want to share your own screen?
I am going to share my screen. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, how does that look?
That's good.
Good? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so this is going to be the last section that we go over. Thank you all for hanging in there for so long. As Michelle was just saying, the Bumble Bee Atlas here is active in 21 states now, which is so wonderful to see such growth since the program launched in 2018. And you can see from all the logos on this screen that we have many partners from state and federal agencies, from universities, other nonprofits that are all working to help this program really grow and really be as successful as it is. And the other benefit of this project is that it's community science, right? Anybody can get involved with this effort, and we provide training for anyone who wants to join, right? We're not just going to send you out into the field. We're going to provide training that's similar across all the states so that everybody is going out with some sort of skills and understanding of bumblebees and understanding of the impact that they are contributing. So community science or citizen science, participatory science, it has a lot of names, right? But we're inviting the public to get involved with helping conserve pollinators. It really gives people a chance to take action rather than just reading about it or being concerned about it. This is a step you can actually take to help us protect bumblebees. And the way that the Atlas works is that we're building a baseline data set. So what that means is as people go out and conduct surveys, right, they've done their training, they're selecting a site to go survey, and they're just going to document what bumblebees they see, what plants the bumblebees are utilizing, what habitats these bees are found in, maybe gather a quick snapshot of any management practices. And all of that information gets submitted and can then be synthesized to help us track population changes over time, help look at distribution changes, start to fill in some of those gaps regarding habitat or foraging associations. And then we can turn that information around and provide it back to our partners or other entities that are looking to support bumblebees and do that on the ground direct conservation effort. So the way that these projects work is the first phase, which most of our Atlas programs, so most of the states are still in phase 1 here, is each of the states are sort of divided into these 50 by 50 kilometer grid cells. So people are going out and doing systematic surveys that are effort limited. So everybody is doing more or less the same survey with some slight variations to account for endangered species or phenology, right? So California is going to have a different start time than northern Minnesota. And the goal here is to gather that baseline data information that I was just talking about. So what bees are there? What plants are they using? What habitats are they in? And turn that around so that we can do some direct conservation on the ground. The next phase for some of our older programs is moving into this long-term monitoring program. So this is for programs that have sort of completed their broad census, right? They've done the phase 1 of the Atlas. They have a good understanding of what bumblebees are there. And so now it's really time to dial in on those at-risk species or look at some of those areas that are very rich with bumblebee species, or maybe it's a section of high quality habitat, selecting stations that we want to monitor year after year to be able to track those changes. And so the goal of this one is to look at those species that we're seeing declines in. It also allows us to work in an adaptive management framework, right? So if we are testing or adjusting a conservation practice or a management practice, having that monitoring data year after year allows us to keep tweaking those practices and make them better for whatever our end goal is. And then we're also aligning this phase with other monitoring programs. So other people that are tracking the Western bumblebee or the rusty patch bumblebee, making sure that our protocols and our end goals are aligning. So here's a map of all of the states heading into the 2026 season. The darker green ones are going into phase 2 or are already in phase 2, so that long-term monitoring. The light green are the states that are still conducting broad census. And if you're in a state that does not have an Atlas program yet, you can still submit photos of bumblebees to Bumblebee Watch or iNaturalist, and that data is still going to be useful for us.
So like I was saying in the beginning, we do provide training. So this is considered part of the training. And the other states and regions are also going to have protocol webinars where you are going to learn about all the nitty gritty, how to conduct a survey, what equipment you need, if you need any permits, the time that you can go out to survey, how to fill out your data sheets. All of that is talked about in the next webinars. And I'll have dates up for those at the end of this talk here. And then we also host a suite of in-person training events where you can learn how to swing a net, how to handle bumblebees, how to photograph bumblebees, just get some hands-on experience with the project methods before you go out. So the training really is meant to sort of give you some confidence, give you some skills so that you are comfortable going out into the field and you're safe while you do it. And all the data that's collected through this project is submitted to a platform called Bumble Bee Watch. And this is a website similar to iNaturalist or eBird, where it's collecting photo observations of bumblebees throughout the United States and Canada. And it launched in 2014, and every single photo that is submitted here is still identified by a human. So everyone that's presenting here tonight usually spends their fall just clicking through thousands of bumblebee photos, sending you feedback, giving you verifications on your species. And when we look at the data in a graph, you can see that the number of observations has really grown over time. So here, this is all the observations that have been submitted to Bumblebee Watch from the time it launched through last year. So on the axis there, you're seeing the number of observations, and then the bottom is the year, right? And you can see that when the first atlas launched in 2018, there was a significant increase in the number of observations that came in. And each year after that, we have grown to a new state or a new region, and those numbers of observations continue to grow, right? This is improving our understanding of bumblebees at a rapid pace. If it were just the 6 of us on screen here trying to gather data on bumblebees, we would not be anywhere close to maybe even 5,000 observations, right? Having your guys' help really allows us to learn about bumblebees and learn about them quickly. Another way that we can look at the data is through sort of the patterns of how it's been collected. A lot of community science projects tend to gather a lot of observations from city centers or metros, right? Where there are a lot of people, you tend to get a lot of observations. So these maps that we're looking at on the screen are county maps of the United States. On the left-hand side, the red, orange, yellow areas are where there are a lot of people. The blue, there's less people. And then the map on the right is looking at bumblebee observations that have been submitted to iNaturalist. And just glancing at these maps, they kind of align, right? You can pick out where LA is, you can pick out where Seattle is, you can pick out where the Twin Cities are. All the large cities in the United States have a lot of observations. But when we look at Bumblebee Watch, that pattern starts to change, right? One of the goals of the Atlas is to get people outside of the city centers into the more remote places, the more rural places, to really understand bumblebees throughout their entire range, right? Not just where we're living, but also where they're living without us. So you can start to see outlines of entire states here, right? We're gathering more data in places where traditional community science projects are not. And all of the data so far, there's probably much more to come, is really helping to inform conservation and monitoring. So there have been multiple scientific publications, statewide conservation strategies have been developed, identification guides have been made, management guidance has been produced, all resulting from Atlas data across the United States. And so some of these documents include the species and summary accounts. So the Pacific Northwest, when they first finished their broad census, they sort of put together this beautiful document that outlined each species they found, looked at the phenology and how that compared to other species in the area, plant and habitat associations, species distribution models, so where you're most likely to encounter each of those species. And we did the same thing this last year for the Midwest. And these documents are meant to be useful, right? We tried to make the data digestible so that people that maybe don't have a background in bumblebees can still find ways to support bumblebees or learn about which species are in their area, what habitats they're found in, what plants they're using. We've also developed habitat management guidance for Pacific Northwest and Nebraska at this point. And these documents cover some of the more common practices, grazing, haying, mowing, fire, and it presents the information in a way that a land steward or a land manager can take how bumblebees are impacted by any given practice and sort of make the best decision for their own land. Everybody has different goals on where they want to get with their management. And so just knowing how bumblebees can be affected allows that land manager to sort of adjust the intensity of a given practice or adjust the timing of a given practice to be even 50% more friendly to bumblebees. Some of our collaborators at the University of Minnesota have also taken a deeper dive in the data to look at ecological associations. They've begun comparing community structures across the state. And these kinds of analyses are really important for learning about endangered species. So in Minnesota, that would be the rusty patch bumblebee, right? And they're starting to tease apart where they exist on the landscape and how their needs might differ from other species in the area. The Washington state is the first state to have a statewide conservation strategy for bumblebees that Xerces Society developed, again, using that Atlas data. And this document is massive, right? It's 250 pages that is just helping the state figure out what they can do to support bumblebees, where they can prioritize their conservation practices, where the species are. And this document has also been turned into an online application, right? So sometimes big documents, it's hard to sort through, but this interactive online application allows people to really explore areas that they're managing, right? There's a whole bunch of filters that they can click on. And it's really just trying to advance conservation in that state. And I think we're in the process of coming up with a few more of those. So it's really exciting to see this information being used in that way. State wildlife action plans. If you haven't heard of those, every state has one, and they're essentially a comprehensive conservation document that each state uses for a period of 10 years and then updates and updates, right? The last round of updates was this last year. And if you've heard us talk about SGCNs or species of greatest conservation need, those species are pulled from these documents. So they have SGCN lists of at-risk species. They have them for sensitive habitats. And when determining these SGCNs, there are calculators involved that use the best available data, right? They're looking at species observations, they're looking at ranges, they're looking at severity of threat factors, climate predictors. And so the Atlas was able to provide a very good bumblebee data set to all of the states shown on the screen here and many more to help them better evaluate the status of bumblebees in their state, figure out which species are higher priority, where they might be. And so the more data, the better, right? The Atlas was really instrumental in a lot of these state wildlife action plan updates this past year. And I know this dashboard has been shown a few times tonight, but I just want to reiterate that everything that is collected through the Atlas is publicly available, unless it is marked private by the submitter. We want people to use this data. We want people to download it and use it. We've also made an interactive, we call it a dashboard, that you can go onto the Atlas website and explore this information for yourself. You can filter down by state, you can look by species, you can look by year, and just really see what people are collecting around you, what they're finding, what you're finding. Lots of cool ways that you can just look at and interact with the data. So here, the next steps for starting with your Atlas program or continuing with your Atlas program is to sign up for the regional webinar that's going to go over the project methods, more of the specifics for surveying, equipment, Bumblebee ID, all the stuff that you need to know before you go into the field. To sign up for these webinars, you can go to our website, bumblebeeatlas.org, to the events tab, and you can register there. A few of the states have already conducted their protocol webinar, but you can find recordings of those either on Xerces YouTube page or on our online training portal on the website. And then along with webinars, our field trainings are starting to be planned. So this map here is a list of where in-person events have been planned so far. Not all of them are up there, especially for the Midwest and Great Plains states. We're still working on getting those scheduled, but there will be a lot of in-person events this year. So make sure to check this map out and sign up for the newsletter if you want to get notifications of when events are planned. And then I would just like to thank our sponsors. Everybody listed on here is really helping make our work possible. And as Rich said in the beginning, Xerces is a member-funded organization. So if you enjoyed today's presentation, if you enjoy the work that we're doing, you can consider becoming a member of the Xerces Society or just making a one-time donation. When you do sign up to become a member, there's a nice gift center where you can choose one of these cool signs for your garden or a book. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who already is a member. And with that, I'll leave our two websites up here, xerces.org and Bumble Bee Atlas. And I think we can go to questions now.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, everybody, for so thoroughly covering all of that wonderful information. I feel like we could probably spend a whole lot more time talking about it, and the wealth of questions coming in, I think, reflect that there's still a lot that we've left uncovered. We did get to most of the questions from the Q&A in the Q&A portal there, so would encourage you to peruse that and read through some of those answers. There are a few questions here that I thought were worth just bringing up. We only have a couple minutes here, but I thought there was a couple questions that were worth just bringing up for larger discussion. One of them that was posted relatively recently was, what's a good response to other people when they ask, why protect bumblebees? Especially if they are suggesting there are plenty of other pollinators. Does anyone on the panel here want to give us a quick elevator speech about why we should protect bumblebees?
Sure, I'll jump in.
Yeah.
We should protect bumblebees because of both intrinsic and functional reasons. They're part of our native biodiversity. As such, I think they have intrinsic value as part of nature, and we should care about that. But they're functionally very important to us too. They are some of the leading pollinators of wild plants, and as we heard earlier, that helps to structure ecosystems through plant reproduction and seed germination and so on, following pollination. And they also are important pollinators of our crops. They're particularly noticeable as visitors to farm fields where they're foraging for food, and in so doing, they are pollinating some of our crop plants. Without pollinators like bumblebees, we could lose some of the things that we value in our diets. And it's not to say that other bees are not important, but bumblebees are distinguished in a variety of ways, and in particular pollination contexts. And so we think that bumblebees are important in their own right for conservation.
I think I would just add to that, Leaf. That was great. Thank you. I think I would just add that bumblebees are also relatively easy to study compared to a lot of our other bees. And that makes them pretty effective, kind of canaries in the coal mine. They allow us to sort of use them as umbrella species for a whole lot of other species. So not to say that every single species of bee would benefit from our actions that we take to protect bumblebees, but a lot of them certainly would. And so I think that's another reason for us to focus on them. They're big, observable, studyable, which I think is important. maybe an appropriate question now, and maybe the last one we'll get a chance to really get to since we're actually 1 minute over our time. But there's a question here about when is the best time in the spring to clean up your garden? And I think the answer would really depend on where you're joining us from and um, and what kind of habitat you live in. But I think for the most part, once temperatures are reliably above, say, 50 degrees, it's probably an okay time for you to clean up your garden. I think in a lot of areas, I've heard people say St. Patrick's Day is a good time after St. Patrick's Day. So after sort of mid-March is probably an okay time to start this. But there are some parts of the country where that's probably not true. So yeah, use your best guess. But generally, when things have warmed up and you're seeing insects flying around, that's an okay time to indicate that a lot of those animals that have overwintered in those plant materials have moved on their way, and it's an okay time to clean up. Xerces has also written a blog about this. I believe that Michelle or somebody else posted the link to that blog in the Q&A there. So I would encourage you to check out that, and any other insights would be welcome from anyone else on the team.
I just dropped a link in the chat as well so everyone can see it.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. With that, I think I will just say thank you all so much for being here and for spending the evening with us. We hope you learned something. Hopefully, maybe your questions taught us something as well, or gave us a place of inquiry to go back and read some things about. There were definitely a couple of questions that popped in there that I didn't have an immediate answer to and had to think about. So it's just wonderful what a amazing community of bumblebee conservation people that we're a part of, and we're so happy to learn alongside of you and to be partners with you in this process. And we hope to just continue to learn with you, and couldn't do it without all of your contributions, as we've, I think, pretty clearly laid out tonight. So we hope you'll join us at our upcoming training events throughout the country, and share your bumblebee observations with us. Let us know what plants you're seeing queens on out there, whether you see any building nests, and share those observations with us. And yeah, we'll look forward to connecting with you as the season moves on. And thank you so much for all that you do and all that you bring to bumblebee conservation. It's a joy to work with you. Thanks a lot.